Welcome, everyone. So happy that you're all here to join us. And I think a few more will be joining along the way. It's a good thing that the door isn't squeaky to come into the room. We're delighted that you're here to join us for this conversation. I'm just looking at the list of folks that are with us. We have professors, we have students, both graduate and undergraduate students in the room right now, postdoctoral scholars as well. So welcome everyone, and we're really. Oh, and then we have someone who's probably in kindergarten sitting over there. I see Christina. Hello. So wonderful. So I am Shoshana Jacobs, and I am part of the team called Manufactured Ecosystems. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what this is. Oh, Nicoletta, you can't hear me. Does that mean no one, or is it, you can hear me? Everyone can hear me? Okay. We need to help. Can someone jump on the, chat and help Nicoletta there? Manufactured Ecosystems is a New Frontiers funded grant. New Frontiers is a transdisciplinary funding stream through the federal government of Canada to basically sort of to try to push the boundaries and the edges of research. And one of the things that it says is it has to be high risk and high reward. And so we thought that this funding stream for the questions that we are answering is perfectly appropriate. And so what the project does is asks the question, can we build a manufactured ecosystem if we have to? And the idea is to explore the boundaries of our technology and to more readily understand the biological systems that are supporting life on Earth. And I am going to turn on the captions. There we go. Cool, thank you. And to basically create a repository of readiness in case we do need to tap into our technology. Of course, though, realizing that we don't have all of the technology now on the planet. The other thing is that we will be tapping into the creative imagination of the human brain through the form of science fiction literature, just as we have been doing forever to get ideas about what technologies we might want to actually realize in our day-to-day life. So for those that appreciate a very simple example, think about Rosie the robot from the Jetsons turned into Roomba, or Dick Tracy's watch into smartwatch. These are sort of imagined technologies that we have been able to develop over the decades. And so this is the project, and the team is spread out from Calgary, I think. Is that our furthest west? It depends on how you look at the map, but let's just say furthest west. And I think our furthest east, is it Greece? I think it is. So we are spread out, Dr. Fitter, across many, many countries. Not a global representation, but we're doing our best, and we're always pleased to have more folks join us as we carry on this project. I would like to stop talking, but first, how this is going to work. Liz is going to introduce our guest. Our guest is then going to decide how to spend the time telling us about the project. And then we're going to have a discussion and questions and comments and ideas. And the other thing, because there are so many early career folks in the room, I do want to share how we actually got here today, because today started with a fan letter. So I read a paper, and it was kind of that moment where you read a paper and you think, oh shit, someone's already done what I want to do, right? And you all of you know what that feels like, right? Especially the early career folks. And so this happened to me. I read this paper called Can We Replace Ecosystem Services with Technology? And I was like, no, Alastair Fitter has done it. And so I wrote a fan letter, and I wrote to Dr. Fitter, and I said, I read your paper. I love it. I want to update it. I want to write a grant around it. And he was absolutely generous and delightful in his response. And we have, through the project, been keeping in touch. And we're just really, really grateful that he is here today to discuss that paper and to help us kind of expand. Now, the one thing that got me was in his email, he said he ended it in a kind of snarky way, I think, because he said, "I look forward to seeing what you're going to do about biodiversity." And I was like, me too. so anyway, please, Liz, go ahead and introduce Dr. Fitter and we'll get started.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. This is so exciting, and I'm so glad, Dr. Fitter, that you were available to come and speak with us across our many time zones that we have going on. And I'd just like to provide a little bit of Dr. Fitter's career background for folks. So he is an emeritus professor of ecology at the University of York in England. So you're coming to us from the afternoon right now. It's just after 3. He's also a past president of the British Ecological Society and VP of the International Association for Ecology. In 2005, Dr. Fitter became an elected fellow of the Royal Society, and Dr. Fitter's research was on functional ecology of root systems and mycorrhiza, soil carbon fluxes, and impacts of climate change. And the reason that Dr. Fitter is here with us today is because of his, as Joe mentioned, 2013 paper called "Can We Replace Ecosystem Services with Technology?", which became foundational for the New Frontiers Exploration Grant, Manufactured Ecosystems. We are so thrilled to have you here today with us to share about your paper and some of the background that inspired it, and engage in this discussion about the topic of replacing ecosystem services with technology. And something that I thought was a really wonderful little exchange that we had in our emails, Dr. Fitter, was when you shared where you'd like the honorarium to be donated to. And you said something with a radical outlook. And I thought that was wonderful. So we are making a donation on behalf of Dr. Fitter as thanks to a place called XR, which is a nonprofit, Extinction Rebellion. And I just thought that was wonderful. And with all of that, I will pass to you to get things started. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. You've no idea, when you're as ancient as I am, how nice it is to find that people are still reading your papers. When I retired, I had this strange discovery that you stop publishing papers and the world continues to turn, and you think, wow, that's amazing. They didn't need me after all. So to find actually somebody did need me is quite remarkable. So thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to. Oh gosh, now you've made me appear full screen. That's alarming. Oh well, it's really good to talk to you. And as you say, I am from the University of York. I see we have York University. So the University of York, I think I'm right in saying, is the only English university which has an overseas namesake which is older than it. So welcome to York University as well. So anyway, I am long retired, so I won't claim any other expertise at all. So this paper came out of a working party which I set up as a result of being part of a Royal Society group, which was responsible for a publication called People and Planet. Came out about, I suppose, I don't know, 12 years ago, something like that. I hope you've had the link to it if anybody's interested. It's actually a really important document. It made some very powerful contributions at the time, I think. And importantly, it linked in natural scientists and social scientists in a way that is now fairly routine, but actually 15 years ago was not. I mean, it was quite hard to find languages that all parties understood well, and we spent a long time making sure we could do that. So that was an interesting experience for me, and I learned a lot as part of that working group about how to interact with social sciences. One of the things that came out of it was this question of the role of ecosystem services, particularly in a situation where the planet was getting more and more overexploited, and where industrialization and other things like that were particularly potent. So as part of the process, I set up a working group which contained an amazing group of people. It was quite stunning how willing people were able to join in on that. And you can see some of the names, I mean, the names of the working group are in the acknowledgements at the end of the paper. And in the end, I mean, the original intention was to put out the findings of this working group as an appendix or something like that to the report. But for various reasons, that didn't happen, timing and other things. So we decided to turn it into an ordinary common or garden paper, as it were, instead. Went into this journal, which is not one what was it called? I've even forgotten the name of the journal. Environmental Economics, is it? Environmental and Resource Economics, that's right, yeah. And that was a journal I'd never encountered before, particularly. But it was Jules Pretty, I think, who was an editor and suggested we sent it there. And actually, it was a good home for it, even though it meant that I suspect the core audience of that journal was a bit bamboozled by all the scientific material in there. But because certainly, and initially at least, I don't think it didn't seem to get a lot of attention. And indeed, some of the attention it got was actually slightly alarming because it was picked up by people who were techno enthusiasts who clearly hadn't read it and took the assumption that from the title that the answer was yes, when it actually isn't yes. The answer is very much more nuanced than that. I was also, I'd been very struck by that quote we give from Gretchen Daly right at the beginning of the paper when she said, it's blindingly obvious that you can't replace them. And we just thought, that's simply not true. And it's not helpful to come out with unsustainable positions like that in a debate like this. So what we really wanted to ask, really tough question: can you do it? And though we touched on the should you do it, the core of it is the can you do it? And the answer is, of course, you can. In some cases, we have. Most importantly, in quite a lot of cases, sometimes with what appear to be largely beneficial effects, and sometimes with clearly bad effects. And it's also quite clear that some of the proposals where it is possible to replace an ecosystem service with a technology are likely also to be bad. But one of the early things we came across, which I think is really important, is this distinction we made between replacement and enhancement technologies. That I thought opened up a lot of doors in understanding how you might view technology in this context. That everybody previously seemed to have talked about replacement. Well, we rapidly realized in this working group that actually very often you weren't simply replacing it. I mean, sometimes you are, without any question, but in many cases, what you're doing is applying technologies to make it possible for the ecosystem service that is still running to cope with the increased demands that are placed upon it. And so I thought that distinction between replacement and enhancement technologies was really, really important. And we really, it became a key part of the other thing was to, we methodically went through all the various services and tried to work out where this was true. And it was surprisingly easy to apply that dichotomy of that classification across the range of services and goods. The other thing was, this was one of the earlier papers in the enormous ecosystem service literature, which adopted that concept of goods, which I think is a really powerful one too. So if you go back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it talks about provisioning services and things like that. But there was a lot of complexity in trying to classify things into that framework. And I'm desperately trying to remember the original paper that came up with the goods terminology. But anyway, we followed that, and it had been a few years before, but it was relatively recent. Actually, that led to an interesting challenge about biodiversity, and that actually we followed that up in a later paper with Ken Norris and Georgina Mace, which you may have seen. It's in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. Georgina very sadly died a few years ago. That was a huge loss to science. She was an absolutely brilliant scientist, and it was a great privilege to be able to work with her on that later paper. But so I think my concern about biodiversity in my original email was that people do sometimes talk about the replacement of technology, of services with technology, without understanding that the role that biodiversity plays, not just in the services, but as a per se value, which is huge, but also in terms of its operation, its interaction with humans in a huge range of other ways. So we wanted to explore that further, because this paper too doesn't really get stuck in any major way to the biodiversity issues. So that I thought I wanted to give you the background to how it came about. It was a sort of a natural consequence, I suppose, of the research I'd done over 40 years, but it wasn't the core part of it. And I think that if I was going to pick things out, I would pick out that indeed that replacement versus enhancement technologies concept, I think is an important and powerful one. And that we should not imagine that any of, that we shouldn't assume ever that anything here is impossible, but we should very definitely ask the question, is it a good idea? And this paper may not go very far down the is it a good idea road, but that seems to me the big question that if you're going to get really engaged with this area, you have to ask. And it's pretty obvious that in some cases it's not a good idea. It's fairly clear that in some cases it's okay. But there's a huge range of other ones where I think there needs to be a debate. Should you do that? And what are the criteria you're going to apply to whether you should do that? And I suppose the most obvious one of those is geoengineering, which back then we were really worried about. That was when it was first being pushed hard, and we felt very strongly that this was a dangerous technology, very dangerous. But we're now getting people saying, well, it may be very dangerous, but maybe we simply have no option. We just have to do it, because actually there will be no alternative. The rate of climate change will be so severe, and it's increasingly looking as though that may be true, that we will have no option but to use potentially really dangerous technologies in an attempt to undo the effects of the genuinely really dangerous technologies that we have been using up to now. So yeah, so that's I think what I would summarize the thing as, and I don't intend to say anything more unless you ask me to, as it were. I'm actually looking forward to hearing you talking about it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think you've introduced some important questions. Now, given the fact that we have quite a few heavy hitters in the room, as well as some older folks who do like to chat quite a bit, I am going to ask if we could please preferentially hear from students and early career folks first. There we go. Dr. Bond, and please introduce yourself and say the awesomest thing you can.
Oh gosh. No pressure.
No.
I'm Shelby Bone. I'm an interdisciplinary postdoc right now, working to problem solve around the interface between art and science. But that's not what my question is about. I think I was really tickled when you said that you're surprised that people are still reading your paper, which is funny because like the older a paper is, the more time people have to read it. So the readership can't go down, actually. Once you've read it, you can't unread it. But I was curious, now that it's about 10 years or so since you wrote it, is there anything in that paper, I think probably that has happened since then that you were surprised by in the field of ecosystem service replacement and technology? Like I think a lot of it is like prospective, sort of like imagining a future and being like, well, here's what we know, here's what could happen. And then did anything really do like a 180 from that? And you were like, whoa, we did not see that coming.
Well, the first thing I should say is that I retired 10 years ago, and I'm not, very consciously not, trying to keep up with all the literature. When I retired, I had this dreadful vision of attempting to continue to be an active scientist and eventually standing up someday at a conference and looking at the room and realizing they all knew more about it than I did. And I just didn't want to get into that situation. So I won't claim a sufficient knowledge of what's been happening on the science and the research end of it to be able to answer that question properly. But I think if I were to write it again then, as it were, I would have said much more about the wisdom of this. I mean, it was very consciously focused on the science of it, and I would want to say more about. I think I'd want just to say, don't do it, you know. And I suppose what really I hadn't seen coming, maybe I had, I don't know, maybe what upsets me is the fact that as a global community, we seem to be completely incapable of grasping the messages that we are willing to say. So, you know, and whether we're talking about individuals or political leaders or whatever, everybody is guilty of saying things and then doing the opposite, as it were. And that really bothers me, I must admit. I mean, I think that, you know, we probably do need to look really carefully at the question of replaceability, because we may just have to do it. We may be in the position of those Chinese fruit farmers who ended up hand pollinating their cherry trees because there were no bees left. And that's a sort of trivial level, but we could find ourselves on a whole range of things simply unable to deliver the services that we need to provide. You know, the goods will not be present unless we do something really quite radical. That's my point about geoengineering. I mean, we may have to do it, even though I think most people would probably say, whoa, this is dodgy.
I am frantically searching robo-bees because that was the saving grace for me, was that you wrote the paper before the invention of robo-bees. So we need to update the paper.
Yeah, but I mean, really, the idea when we have perfectly good bees that we would invent robo-bees is just weird. It's seriously weird. Yeah. I mean, bees are free.
Yeah. Karina, or Dr. Benazaya, please, and then Dr. Zapaki, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I had two questions. The first one was, like, you talked a lot about messaging, and I think it's something that we are grappling a bit as a group on this topic as well, because it's a fascinating topic of what if, but at the same time, we don't want the message to be, oh, look, there's replacement, and therefore we don't need to care or manage nature now. So I was wondering whether you had thought of this before writing the piece, or whether that would change if you were rewriting it now. And my second question was, like, about 10 years ago, people were still thinking a lot about cultural services, and there's lots of changes on how we think about those. So if you were to rewrite that piece, how would you address cultural services now in relation to, you know, the paper that you wrote?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm sure one would give far more attention. I mean, they are, I confess, rather dismissed at the end of the paper in a paragraph or something, which is, yeah, when you read it now, you think, oh, come on, it's a bit more important than that. I guess at the time, most people in the scientific community felt uncomfortable on that territory. You know, it felt as an area where you would be easily open to being dismissed as going off into waffle territory, as it were. And indeed, actually, it was very easy to do that. I mean, there wasn't the literature that I think there is now, which would enable you to say, more coherent things about it. So yeah, I'm sure that would be different. I guess there isn't a paper written 10 years ago that the authors wouldn't find different ways of writing now. So I excuse myself on those grounds, but the point you make is completely right. Yeah.
Hello, and nice greetings from Greece, from Athens. I hope you hear me now. All are fine. Yes, good, wonderful. Um, I'm a literary scholar working on comparative literature, environmental humanities, and post-humanities, and curious to learn from Professor Fitter, and congratulations for your lecture. If you feel that concepts like parasitism, mutualism, symbiosis, because we have already published an open access volume on symbiosis, if you think that these concepts are helpful to our argument regarding the replacement of technologies or ecosystems or vice versa, because I feel that sometimes some humanistic oriented concepts are really helpful to understand more the relationship between human and more than human world. And how about your opinion, your reflections on these concepts, and in general about the future of the relationship between ecosystems and technologies? Because this is a great topic. There are many voices. For example, transhumanism actually support a lot the technology, the technological part, while the environmentalists tell us, oh no, there is no way to replace ecosystems by technology. So I'm wondering your opinion about such things and the disciplines. I'm actually environmentalist, so I must admit, no transhuman. Yes, thank you.
So how useful are concepts like symbiosis in this discussion? Because that seems to me to be a really interesting question. I mean, in one level, of course, most of those ecosystem services involve those interactions. I mean, there is a category in there of ecological interactions, and that's what these things are. But I think you could actually take it further, because you could ask the question as to whether the technologies can be symbiotic. In other words, can we live with them? And some technologies are clearly not ones we actually live with. They impose themselves upon us in various ways. Others actually, as it were, enhance our own abilities. And we can be, I think you could argue that we are being symbiotic with those. And that would be a really interesting discussion to take forward, I think, the extent to which you can use those terminologies in looking at the interactions of humans with technology. That's not a field I know anything about at all, but I know there is a big discipline of human technology interactions, and I'm sure somebody in that must have considered this. If they haven't, here's a golden opportunity for you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Darius, please introduce yourself and ask a question or a comment.
Hi, I'm Darius. I'm a master's student at Guelph, looking at niche partitioning with large herbivores in South Africa. In terms of engineering, providing ecological services as a result of this, have you also taken into account possibly how this might affect conservation with animals that are seen as major ecological engineers as well? For example, do you think that might take away from conservation, or are you trying to in a way work in kind of conjunction with some of these conservation areas in terms of protecting those different species as well? For example, a lot, for example, with bison, and I guess in North America, are you looking at also ways in which conservation can also go to help them as well, if they're providing something like that? And also another thing, are you perhaps taking into account that the fact that in comparison to most animals and creatures who perform a specific ecological niche, humans usually don't do as great in comparison. have you thought of like ways in which to counteract that, or like figured out ways in which we could probably like fix or work in conjunction kind of with that in order to like combat that, or like for example, like in when it comes to like hunting and stuff like that, it turns out that like large predators or like mesopredators are better at managing like populations in comparison to like hunters or something like that. Like kind of an example like that. If that makes sense, it feels like I'm rambling a little bit, but yeah.
Wow. Well, there's rather a lot there. Wow. So the bit at the end about whether humans are different from other animals, other organisms, in the way they occupy niches. If that's what you're saying, I don't think that's true. I think you can have extraordinary range of niche breadth across organisms. Some have very broad niche breadths, some very, very, very narrow indeed. But it's the concept of niche is it's undefined. There's no clear definition. You can't measure. How many dimensions are you going to measure niche in? There was a great passion when I was a rather younger researcher, sometime in the early 19th century, for people talking about the n-dimensional hypervolume of niches. I'm never quite sure what the point of it was, because nobody knew how to quantify an n-dimensional hypervolume. It was an interesting idea. It basically said that a niche is a very complicated thing, and therefore I've always steered slightly clear of it as a working term. But so I think humans are just another organism in the system. We happen to be extraordinarily abundant, and we happen to have very, very broad niche activities, if you want that term. But I don't think we're different. And that takes me back to your main point, I think, which is how important is conservation? Where does conservation fit into this? And how do you fit biodiversity? I mean, that's what I do now. When I retired, I became a full-time conservationist. That's what I do. That's why I want you to give the money to XR. So I think that my own view, straightforward, is that you are not going to get effective ecosystem services without biodiversity-rich ecosystems. The ecosystems that are simply narrowed down to a core are going to either be poorly functional or incredibly unsustainable. They will eventually collapse, and you'll be left without the service. So I think it's really straightforward. I think one of the things that worries me is, though the lip service is now paid to the idea that we have to have we have two separate crises in biodiversity and climate change, and that they're interlinked. Actually, all the actions that are taken treat them as quite separate things. And they're not. They are absolutely interlinked. They are to do with the way we have grossly overexploited our environment. And in doing so, we have eliminated the habitats of vast numbers of species. And in doing that, we have removed the ability of the planet to provide us with the goods that we depend on. We've focused on turning the planet into a producer of certain goods, notably food, and we've forgotten about the desperate need we have for other goods. And you can take a stable climate as one, and you can take water as another. So these are fundamental things that we need, and we're not really paying much attention to them because they are less marketable. It's a problem of late stage capitalism, I'm afraid. Things that are marketable get priority in the system. And the things that are not marketable just get pushed to the edges.
That makes me think about the problem with putting a price on being late to pick up your child from daycare is that some people find that price reasonable and are happy to pay for it. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with the work that we're doing, is by describing as close as possible to what it will cost us. Some of us are willing to go there in a way that we're trying to say, no, no, no.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a simple consequence of the now grotesque inequality that we have in societies across the world. That there are, there's a set of people who can basically pay for anything, and there's another set of people who can pay for nothing.
Yeah.
And that produces a really, really. I mean, there's a very interesting series of articles this week in the Guardian newspaper, and I'm sure you all go to the Guardian website as your main source of news. It's the only reliable source of news I know, and it's doing a series this week about the impact of the 1%,
Right.
And the extraordinary impact. I mean, we've known this all along, but to have it quantified is really pretty terrifying. It's also quite terrifying to realize how the enormous impact the top 10% have, because then you discovered actually you're in that top 10%. So that's true for me. I'm in the top 10%. And when I see the impact that my peer group has, that's pretty worrying.
Yeah. Thank you. Dave.
Yeah, I've been on Mark's camera, but I'm on my own here now.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I am a PhD student with Mark and Show. I am in the, I'm Dave Dohanick. I am in the theater department with PhD student with Mark and Show. My background is, I think people have been hinting towards it, human-computer interaction design, digital art, sort of that realm. And I think as someone who's worked in the field and been frustrated and come back to academia for those purposes, my questions come to how do we deal with the fact that we're obsessed with digital technology speed when biology often sort of has the answers that colonization has made us forget. And so when I reference that, as someone who's really interested in assistive technology, I was loving that we had bat sonar replication technology for individuals who are vision impaired. But then when you really research into it, you can sonar yourself with clicking noises. And that's just been told by people not to do that because it's socially unacceptable. And so how do we move past these? And I think we've been getting towards that conversation to this, but that's just sort of where my interest and questions lie.
Wow, that's a pretty alarming statement. I had no idea that people would be told that it was socially unacceptable to use that behavior. That's extraordinary. Yeah. I'm not sure I can make any other comment on what you said, which is fantastic. And because you're an expert in human-computer interactions, you'll be able to answer the earlier question about human technology interactions.
What Dave was just sharing there made me think about one of the components of this project that Mindy and Mariam are working on designing tools for the future. And Dave, what you said about how we're wanting to like digitize and make these technologies, but really they already exist in other ways. And Show, you made a comment about how maybe the tools for the future are actually tools that already existed in the past.
I'm really excited about that. We have a class, Dr. Fitter, of engineer students who are going to be designing sort of hand tools for the future, sort of in the context of a climate collapse. And we have some anthropologists and some engineers that are kind of working together to do that. And we'll be 3D printing them and trying them out and seeing how they work in which contexts and that kind of deal. And I think there is this incredible knowledge waste. I think we are, if we waste anything the most, I think it's knowledge. And I think a lot of our knowledge waste leads to material waste. And the idea of creating these circular knowledge economies, and that's something that I'm working on right now. So these are not terms that have really been published anywhere. These are just terms in my head, but these circular knowledge economies my argument is, will help us reduce waste. And certainly there are things out there in the world that exist in the form of knowledge, like in the cloud, in like maybe a real cloud that we do need to tap into before we just keep on generating more widgets and waste, right? Yeah. Alex, please introduce yourself and ask your question. And then I think we'll, after Alex, we'll allow some of the older folks to chime in.
Yeah. So hello, I'm Alex. So I'm currently like a fifth year zoology student who is about to graduate in like 2 weeks, in 1 week or two weeks. And then currently I've been thinking about like the next step for me is my master's, but like currently I've been looking at like, a couple of things like about like how like technology can replace like ecosystem services. So one of these is actually like the like a lot of the carbon capture like technologies, like because like you know how like often we have like a lot of wetlands and forests to like capture the carbon, but then since a lot of like human development is like getting rid of those, like there's been a lot of proposals of like having these artificial trees which can like capture a lot more carbon from the air, like also like which is like a technology replacing an ecosystem services as well as like freezing carbon in polar regions and like carbon dioxide in the cold polar regions and then like and then turning the carbon back into its original form or like some I've also heard about some technologies which try to like use some sort of like minerals to react with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to turn them back into their original carbon form, like so like these are all examples of like carbon like capture technologies. So like, and I think the ones that would be stand out to you is like the artificial trees. So what's your thought on this kind of like topic?
I think it falls into the category of technologists having fun. Personally, I think I mean the artificial trees in particular. I think you mean. Sorry, do you mean actual artificial trees? So things that look like trees but have been constructed to absorb carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, and they only look like trees because that's a good way of filling space with your with the devices you're using for carbon capture. The alternative is the genetically engineered trees, which people have also talked about, which have a much higher carbon rate of photosynthesis in effect. I mean, which of those are you actually thinking of?
Oh, I wasn't sure, but I just heard about this concept of like artificial trees overall. Like,
okay, well, both those ideas have been put forward. I think, I mean, the idea of sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is, I mean, I'm all in favor of people working on these technologies. What I'm not in favor of is anybody imagining that in the reasonable future, they will be much use to us. I mean, it may be that in 50 years' time, there will be available on large scale technologies which can do a lot of good in that way. And I hope people work on them. And I hope that they eventually are valuable. But it seems to me at the moment to be a distraction from the major problem, which is that we are just pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at an unbelievably high rate. As the other thing that's been put forward quite strongly is the idea that you could basically genetically engineer lots and lots of different plants, trees, crops, whatever, to capture far more carbon than otherwise. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but nobody ever thinks through, or if they do, they don't say it, the other implications of that. I mean, for a start, if you're going to capture far more carbon from the air, you're going to need to capture far more nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera, to construct the tissues which are going to do that. So there's going to be a huge demand for nutrients, which means that your soil, you're either going to have to grow these plants with massive doses of fertilizer, and then you've got the problem, where does the fertilizer come from? So people then say we're going to engineer nitrogen fixation into the plant as well. And you end up going down a route which is so complex that the chances of achieving it in short term are small. But anyway, but even if you succeeded it, I don't think people nobody who does this sort of thing thinks ecologically. These systems are going to have to be put on land, and that land at the moment is either used for food production or something equally goods producing, or else it's wildland. And we know that we have lost huge areas of wildland, and it's under intense pressure, particularly in areas of high population density and low altitude, so that you can grow crops. And we're losing forests, lowland forests throughout the world at a terrifying rate, which is, I mean, that would undo all the good that these technologies might do before you'd even develop the technology. So they seem to me to be actually completely mad ideas, but I don't mind anybody working on them as long as they don't think that they're a replacement for fixing the crisis in the first place.
I think that's so interesting, the way that you just described all of the many different pieces of it, and how complex it would be to get something to a point that it would be actually useful. People would, not all people, I feel like our group here, we're also on the conservation mindset. We don't want to have to replace everything with technology. But people would rather, it seems, work really hard to develop these technologies than work really hard to protect what we have and make the necessary changes so that we don't need these technologies, is this feeling that I get sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah.
Dr. Fitter, I could just listen and talk to you all day, I feel like. I was recently brought onto this team, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to work with the great minds in this group. I am a veterinarian and an epidemiologist, and I study the epidemiology of mental health and well-being, primarily in farmers and veterinarians. And so I have two daughters, and I've raised them that we don't really use the word hate. And I just, I hate everything I'm hearing. It terrifies me, to be honest, that, no, terrifies is the wrong word. I find it very disheartening that we have allowed ourselves as a species to get to the place where we are. And I have grave concerns around the mental health and well-being impacts that could potentially come from further mass scale loss of biodiversity and climate change, and our fascination with technologies and the seeming societal obsession with quick technology fixes rather than doing the hard work for change that ought to be done. And I worry about spiritual connections that we have with the land. We know that vulnerable groups are particularly dependent on the land for spirituality and connection. This is Diana who has joined us. I really worry about the mental health and well-being and spiritual impacts that embracing technology, especially, as you say, if it's done instead of the hard work of change. I really worry about that, and I'm wondering what your thoughts might be.
I completely agree with you. I mean, it is worrying. As I said before, I mean, there is nothing difficult technologically about any of this, actually. We know exactly what to do. We're just not willing to do it as a set of societies. And we seem to be actually traveling at the moment in the wrong direction. And I have no idea what that means in terms of our survival. I mean, I have children, I have grandchildren. I'm not going to be around to see the catastrophe that we are currently cooking up, but they are, and that upsets me hugely. My own view is that technology properly harnessed and intelligently applied is really valuable, and we've used it in the past in ways which have been fine. So, I mean, I give the example in the paper of water treatment. There is no large human settlement in the world which can survive without water treatment. So we years and years ago, well, roughly 200 years ago, I suppose, abandoned the idea that the natural processes of water purification were sufficient. They were. I mean, for a while, they were. But even the Romans knew that there was a problem, and they had, various forms of waste disposal, which ensured that it didn't overwhelm their settlements. They didn't just then do anything with the waste. It went straight into the nearest river, and it probably was not a great idea to live downstream on the Tiber from Rome, But nevertheless, they started the process of recognizing that the natural services can get overwhelmed, and our increasing tendency to live in enormous settlements produces very serious problems, because those settlements can no longer produce food, so they are dependent on food being transported in. They can no longer rely on local water sources. They're dependent upon water being transported in. They can no longer rely on waste disposal mechanisms, natural. So that, and years ago we adopted mechanisms for doing that, and they were generally benign. So, the good old-fashioned sewage farm with, stuff being sprayed on a circular rotating spray thing onto gravel, and it then went. And the microbiology of the sewage farm was well known and well established, and it worked. And out the bottom end came okay water. I mean, you might not want to drink it, but it was certainly okay to go into a river, and then the natural purification would continue. But our systems are now completely overwhelmed by that, and we're no longer coping. So I don't know what Canadian rivers are like, but I can tell you that I wouldn't want to swim in an English river.
Dr. Baisley, please go ahead.
Hi, Alastair. I would have last met you when I was a graduate student in the 1980s. Nice to see you again. Looking so great.
I remember.
So my question is, what are your thoughts on what the main pulse points or driving points or levers today that need to be pushed, given that scientists have been saying all of this stuff for decades now and no one's listening? And then in the chat, I put, other than supporting Extinction Rebellion, yes. You pointed to late stage capitalism. The rich got richer during the pandemic, and all the Guardian and Washington Post articles on the reporting on the Oxfam report on who is doing the greenhouse gas emitting.
Yeah.
What do we do?
So what's the pressure point? How can we make something happen? I wish I knew, because clearly rational argument doesn't cut it. You're not. That's what's behind XR. I'm a supporter of XR because you've got to try everything. I think whether that has the slightest chance of producing the right response, I have no idea at all. But what do we do? Well, I guess you look around the world and you find that populists are doing increasingly well. So we've got Argentina a few days ago, Holland yesterday. Holland? Huh? What is going on in the world? So I guess the answer is possibly that we need to take something out of the playbook of the populist. And we actually need to start turning people against the big polluters in that way, so that people somehow have got to come to see environmental destruction as being worse than uncontrolled immigration or whatever at the moment most exercises them. And how you get people to understand that environmental destruction is actually seriously bad for them is a mystery to me. I wish I knew the answer. If I knew the answer, I would be implementing it now. And I wouldn't be wasting my time talking to all you. But no, I don't. I wish I knew. It baffles me. About 4 years ago, the first really bad Australian wildfires. I think they were about 4 years ago, and I remember watching film of those, and it was Armageddon, and people were being burnt alive in the most horrifying ways. And I thought, this is going to be the thing that changes people's minds. It's been shown on television sets all over the world. People are going to say, oh, wow, this climate change stuff is real. And it didn't have absolutely no effect at all. And you can have it again. You've had it in Canada. You probably had almost the worst example anywhere in the world in Canada. Has it resulted in a mass change of views? No. People are willing to say, oh, well, I'm glad I wasn't there. You know, it seems to be as far as people go. So somehow we have to get across the message that environmental destruction, and that's the term I would use, it is environmental destruction, is the worst thing that can happen, because it can actually lead to be impossible for you to have a happy and fruitful life in the future. How you do that, I don't know, but somehow we have
make it a moral imperative, a question of ethics, a question of empathy, because that's what I'm seeing is really needing to surface.
Yeah.
But thank you.
You can write as many scientific articles as you want and you won't have any effect, I'm afraid. Yes,
absolutely. We keep on reminding our students, like the average citation number of a paper is 1. And occasionally you'll get 2 or 3. Okay, Dr. Lipton, I think this is going to be our last, unless someone gets an idea or a thought, but please go ahead, Dr. Lipton.
Where can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, my name is Mark Lipton. I'm a professor in the College of Arts and the School of English and Theatre Studies. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I work for Environment and Climate Change Canada in their Communications and Science Communications Division. Been teaching communication-related courses for over 35 years. And my background, we were from an interdisciplinary program called Media Ecology. Building on some crucial texts. Some are from across the disciplines. And when I am able to sort of frame the work that you've done from my point of view across the disciplines, I have more questions about the different kinds of replacements or enhancements like that. There are subcategories of subcategories of subcategories. And I shared in the chat Marshall McLuhan's some of his ideas, like the frontier in technology is actually the human body. We're always trying to design something that extends the human body more so than the ecosystem. The body the person comes first, right? That's the anthropogenic change. So I wonder if for my peers working in hard disciplines, if there's an ideological bias that might get in the way of people seeing the bigger picture. So that's my sort of first question. You also talked about like good and these are good, these are not good, these are good and bad. And I wanted to frame it along the lines of where we were going in this conversation with Don's question. It's not just good or bad. It's, is it right or is it wrong? And I mean morally. Like, we don't talk about moral criticism, but what's the moral imperative here? And I sort of want to end with by pointing to a smaller book from an economist. It's called something like "Small is Beautiful." And yes. And the smaller we can keep our worlds, the more likely we can enhance and replace ecosystem services on small scales. I wonder if that's a possible answer. And then the last thing I'm going to say is I come from the world of ACT UP and activism. The answer is you don't talk about it, you do it. You identify small groups of people, you form cells like terrorist organizations, and you blow things up until people pay attention. That's the model for revolution. And ultimately, all of our other efforts become benign because at some point, someone's going to start blowing things up, or the planet itself will kick back and start blowing things up. Which, I hope I'm not around for. And I'm not encouraging anyone to blow things up. There are a couple of questions there because I've been so excited. So I hope, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet you and to ask, and for this group for bringing you here. I hope, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I was wrong. It's Schumacher, not Illich, isn't it? Small is beautiful, but yeah. I completely agree with you that working from a small scale up is a really clever strategy. And it's what, as you say, revolutionaries have always done. Fidel Castro, was a small, there were 20 of them in the jungles or whatever it was, but and they achieved their goal. It doesn't always work. There are plenty of examples in history of revolutionary movements that have petered out very quickly indeed. So I think there's a risk of taking examples that have worked and assuming that that's the model you have to follow. So I caution about that, but I particularly caution because the timescale is really tight. We are actually in a crisis, and we have to find something that produces rapid results, and we've failed miserably so far. There is COP, is it 28 next week?
Yeah.
Have you seen anything in any major media about it? No. It might as well not be taking place at all. I suspect, given the way it's being chaired and organized, it might as well not be taking place at all, because I can't see how. The conflicts of interest built into it are now so extreme that I can't see how it's going to come up with anything useful. But that's terrifying, because that is the mechanism that we are currently relying on to produce the outcomes that we want. So I really worry. I'm sorry to end on a really down note, but it is a very bad thing. I've been flicking through the some of the comments, and I think you fantastic comments in there, by the way. I think wow, what a group. I wish I were joining you on a more regular basis. I'm not volunteering necessarily, but there's some really thoughtful comments in there. And to go back to the original theme about technology, I could see there's a few points being made back by your leader there, if that's the right term, which are exactly spot on. Exactly. We can't turn our backs on technology. Technology is there. It's going to be used. What we have to find is the ways of using it urgently and effectively. And there are people who understand these things by orders of magnitude better than I do who will do that. But my view is that I would love to think that we can work in a small way and achieve things that way, but and we have to do that. Everybody has a personal responsibility to act appropriately and to try to persuade and to change behaviors and so on and so forth. But we need system change in a way that I don't otherwise see happening. So thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And so everyone, a virtual round of applause, please. Dr. Fitter, thank you so much for joining us. So grateful for this opportunity. I know that we've had a good conversation when most of the thoughts start with, that makes me think about, and then the sharing of our own expertise. And I think there's been a lot of that today. And I really appreciate it. Thank you, especially to the early career folks who joined us today. Your life is a lot more complex than ours. And so we really appreciate the input that you've had here to enrich the conversation. And so with that, I will say thank you to everyone, and we will continue to do our good work. Very shortly, I think there will be a manuscript that we've been calling the Updated Fitter Paper, and I'd be delighted to share it with you in draft form at some point for your comments. But otherwise, we will leave you alone unless you want to join it at any point. So thank you so much, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.